When Psalm 32 opens up, we read, "Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." Now let me ask you something. Do you ever get the feeling in life like you're just trying to play catch up? And just follow me on this one for a minute. Because we know that our sin is covered, yet we still react sinfully. It's like this big circle where we mess up, we feel guilty, we try again. We mess up, we feel guilty, we try again. So the thing is, we realize our actions are sinful, retrace our steps, promising ourselves that we won't make the same mistake again. It's just this game of playing catch up. So rather than taking a proactive stance, so many times in life we find ourselves falling victim to this reactive state where we react more emotional than logical in our responses. And for me personally, my entire life seemed to be plagued by this reactivity. And I'm not saying I react negatively or out of aggression all the time, but here's the thing. I have 3 kids. They're all young. So sometimes their behavior kind of aligns with the sun and the moon and the stars. And there's this tidal shift in behavior, and the craziness is overwhelming. And my emotions and my feelings trump any sort of logic or rational thinking. But even sometimes, closing myself off from those surrounding me is still a form of reaction. So rather than approach a given situation where I was unsure of what the result would be, I would lean more towards just shutting down completely. I was very much one who didn't want to rock the boat, but the problem that I found with this attitude is I really didn't take a stance either way. I really had no convictions, and I was more just concerned with pleasing everyone, which led to a lot of internalizing things in a very negative and destructive way. And in turn that led to drinking and drugs and alcoholism, and then just this huge maze of confusion and darkness. And you can easily see the error in this approach to life and in this approach to living. Even if I had a voice, which we all do, I was so afraid to use mine because I was so concerned about making myself vulnerable. And if I made myself vulnerable, what then? What if no one liked me? What if they thought I was a bit off my rocker, my perception and my outlook in life? And you can easily see the pattern that, I was allowing fear of what others might think of me or how they might react dictate my approach to life in a way that hindered any sort of real relationship building. David paints this beautiful picture in Psalm 32 of forgiveness and how when we keep sin captive in our hearts, it leads to anguish and pain. Verse 5 says, "I acknowledge my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity." And he's referring to coming to the Lord unashamed, just revealing ourselves to him. When we trust God and move towards him, it creates this love that can never be achieved outside of allowing ourselves to be vulnerable unto him. Verse 8 says, "I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you." And I read that and I just think, what way am I going? And I ask you the same question, what way are you going? What I realize is that God's guiding this journey, but I need to take that first step. God's presence, it's all around me. It's all around us all the time. But I need to go first, and I need to step into that presence. We all need to step into that presence. And he's already there, and he sees us, but we need to move into him. And I need to think about how God is going to use my vulnerabilities and fears as a way to draw me closer to him through love and trust, and in turn, closer to others in relationships. And I need to make myself vulnerable first and not wait for someone else to go first. Here's the thing, making ourselves vulnerable creates a platform for relationship. When Jesus laid down his life, and we read in Matthew 27:50, it says, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." We're able to see the pinnacle, the climax of what a vulnerable spirit can do. A soul that bared everything so that we can come to him with nothing except faith in our hearts and a burden on our back. Jesus came to us not fearing what the response is going to be. I looked up the definition of vulnerable, and it's kind of funny what it says. It says susceptible to physical or emotional attack or harm. Sounds fun, right? I bet if you ask someone what their ideal day would consist of, I highly doubt that they'd welcome the idea of the attack on their emotions or their physical well-being. Most people don't run towards pain with open arms and a welcoming heart. It's not anyone's first choice, or second or third for that matter. But check it out. Have you ever been in a relationship, and I'm not talking just a strictly romantic one, but any relationship for that matter, and if you're breathing and you're watching this, then the answer is yes, you have been in a relationship. But sometimes, you ever been in one where you're just waiting on the other party to make the first move, just to open up a little so you can share what's on your heart, to crack the door just enough to see their heart so you can respond out of your own. Now, wouldn't it be cool if we all got to the point where we're fighting to go first? To be the one that can create this platform that invites others into our lives. And when we trust God, that's exactly what happens. Verse 10 states, "Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord." You see, there's this loving trust that's bred when we're vulnerable to our Maker that establishes a deeper relationship. A relationship that is developed even when our own inadequacies infiltrate our thoughts and attempt to sabotage a bond that is created out of love. Jesus tells us in John 13, he says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." And the thing is, you can't love in a vacuum, you know? You can't approach people with unconditional love from the comforts of a cocoon where no one's allowed to come in. You know, for us to love one another, we have to first realize that God is already aware of our own issues, and he loves us in spite of them. And he forgives us in light of our own transgressions, you know, which enables us to see others with that same sort of compassion and that same sort of love and sincerity. You know, David, he writes, "Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit." You know, the godly aren't expected to be sinless. Rather, the godly are the expectant of God's promises. You know, David felt the load of his sin, yet he tells us they are forgiven. And the thing is, we're all forgiven too, because Jesus went first in approaching this relationship. You know, when he came to earth, he made himself vulnerable. He exposed himself for all that he is, and the suffering that he endured for our freedom hinged on the fact that we can't do it alone, and he had to. And it was through that suffering that a loving and lasting relationship emerged. You know, and it's totally natural to ask, you know, well, what if I go first and I get hurt? You know, what if we're not strong enough to go first in a relationship? And there's nothing wrong with this thinking, but I suggest don't live in that space. We can visit those thoughts, but please don't sign a 30-year mortgage on a feeling that was never meant for your growth. Jesus, he tells us in 2 Corinthians, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." See, when we realize our weaknesses as man and we turn to God for strength, that's when his power is perfected. It's a matter of coming to that relationship sooner than later, knowing that we cannot be strengthened on our own devices. We have to turn to him. He might ask, "Andy, what if I go first and it's not reciprocated?" And I want you to look at that question in a different light and say, what if you go first and it is reciprocated? You know, think of all the airways that could be opened up, all the blockades that could be removed, and all the bridges that can be built. And it's not going to be instantaneous. It's not going to be 100%. But like anything that has any aspect of longevity attached to it, there has to be a solid foundation. And that foundation is laid when we embrace our vulnerabilities and move towards one another out of love. And if it's not received, think about what our friend James writes, that "Count it all joy, my brothers, when we meet trials of various kinds, for you know that testing of your faith produces steadfastness." And God will test us. And when we approach him with certain faith, he will acknowledge that. And it will be according to his timing, though. Not our timing, his timing. We just have faith and we have to step into that. And it's not going to be easy. It's not even going to be comfortable. But I will say one thing. It will be freeing and it will be redemptive. You know, a few months ago, I had to approach a situation that was so outside my comfort zone that outside of God, I couldn't have had the strength to step into it. You know, 3 years ago, I walked through a divorce, and it was very ugly, very nasty divorce, and there was a tremendous amount of pain that was attached to the circumstances. And for 3 years, almost every time that I would talk to my parents, my ex-wife was the primary subject of conversation. And it finally got to the point where I couldn't handle it anymore. The toxicity that surrounded the conversations began to lead to resentment towards them, and the unhealthiness of it all was taking its toll. But through prayer and counsel and a lot of reflection, I had to confront my parents in a way that goes against everything that I used to define myself as, you know, a shy, non-confrontational people pleaser. But when I invited God into this conversation and I approached my parents with a very hard boundary that prohibited the discussion of my ex, I wasn't sure what the response was going to be. I expected an emotional attack, which is what defines vulnerability. The result, though, was an invitation to a greater relationship with them, a relationship that was possible because I allowed myself to go first. even though I feared what was on the other side of that door. And some of you may be in a similar situation, not an exact situation. I know we all have different levels of pain and suffering, and you might look at my situation and be like, that's not a big deal. Some might look at it as a huge deal. To me, it was just, this moment in my life was a pivotal growth spurt in my walk with Christ, because I put my trust in Him. And even if you're reluctant to dive into these deeper parts of your heart, then at least start small. You might have one little question that's burning inside of you that you've been wanting to ask, or that one little idea that you want to share with your spouse, but you're afraid if you share, she might think you're delusional, or she might think your idea is silly or stupid. But those are all doubts and fears that the devil puts inside of you. I'm telling you, just share a little bit of your heart, and you will see the fruits of this conversation develop. When we invite God into these moments, we rejoice in Him. We read in Deuteronomy 31:8, it says, "It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." And they're powerful words, and in black and white they seem simple, but I will assure you these are not easy things to do. We know that He won't leave us and He goes before us. But the thing is, we're also very human. We're so fragile. And we often see our weaknesses so much more clearly than anyone else ever could. And the reason they can't see their weaknesses is because their vision is blurred by the examination of their own weaknesses. We all have doubts, we all have insecurities, but God can use that stuff to strengthen you. But you have to trust in Him to do that. The Lord is preparing a unique way for every child of His, and He doesn't want us to fear that, because He's right there with us, walking with us through it all. We need to at least start moving in the forward direction on this path, and not stop and set up camp along the journey. We're all going to come to places of discomfort and unrest, but I assure you that God is clearing the way for you so you can forge ahead. The closing verse in Psalm 32 says, "Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart." But it says be glad in the Lord, not in your circumstances, not in your situation. Be glad in the Lord, for He is faithful to you. And making ourselves vulnerable, I'm telling you, is not natural, which is why Jesus had to show us the way. He came down from the comforts of heaven to make Himself vulnerable for every one of us. He wrapped Himself in flesh and walked this earth as a man, and it was through that vulnerability that we were able to draw near to Him, to form a relationship with Him. Verse 3, David says, "For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through groaning all day." It sounds horrible. And David was referring to withholding his confession of sin. And I think we can all relate to that in one way or another. See, I can approach God with all these wonderful things that I did today. I can tell God, "Hey, I really dug into the Word today. Did you see when I opened the door for that sweet old lady at the grocery store? Hey God, I volunteered for another shift in the kids ministry. Isn't that awesome?" But sometimes I don't want to tell Him about the negative stuff. I don't want to tell Him how I cussed someone out on the road. I don't want to tell Him about how I yelled at my kids, how I doubt my ability to be a dad. I don't want to tell Him that I feel incredibly selfish at times. But the thing is, He already knows that, and when we withhold things, we tend to carry a heavier weight than we are ever intended to carry and that we were ever designed to do. And we often forego the joy that God establishes before us. And I challenge everyone here tonight to talk to God and ask Him to show you your vulnerabilities, because He sees them all anyway. And you can't hide from Him. And I mean that in an encouraging way. He sees what is grinding away at your heart. He sees my weaknesses clear as day, and sometimes I want to hold on to that because it's a form of control. I'm telling you, just let it go. Make yourself vulnerable to Him, because He did the same for us. And as a church, let's start moving toward one another in a way that we approach God with openness and honesty and the curiosity, with a childlike curiosity. And oftentimes we need to move towards one another. We need to move towards the chaos. Even when our heart is trembling, we need to move towards it. Levi Lusko, a pastor in Montana, he writes what he calls "Running Towards the Roar" in his book "Through the Eyes of a Lion," which I recommend to anyone. But what he's talking about when he says run towards the roar is that when a lion hunts, the male lion will step out in front of the prey. So when the prey moves towards the male lion, the lion will just let out a roar. And what happens is the prey will turn and will retreat and will run away. But what it doesn't know is that what's waiting behind it is the whole pride of female lionesses ready to pounce and attack. And when he says run towards the Lord, it means sometimes we have to move towards what we're most afraid of. We have to be vulnerable because we are being susceptible to pain and attack. But there's freedom because what's behind us, it might be familiar, but it's not going to be fulfilling, you know. And oftentimes the one thing that we fear is the response. You know, we're afraid of the response that we might get. But we'll never know until we step out onto that platform of vulnerability and leap out in faith, because he tells us steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. It's all about trust in that vulnerability. So trust him and rejoice in the fact that he approached us first.